Today we are unpacking another chess puzzle here live on chess.com, 2200 to 2400. Let's begin by looking at the material. So we have 3 pawns. Our opponent has 5 pawns, and both sides have 2 knights, 2 rooks, and a queen. So we're down a bit of material here to start, and we're going to be looking to recuperate some of that material. Is a checkmate possible in this position? We have a queen that's eyeing the f8 square through this c5 rook, but currently there is no way for us to access that square because of this blockade that's supported by the queen. But it's a motif that we should definitely pay attention to as we dive deeper into this puzzle. Another motif here that I'm seeing is this double attack on the b6 queen and the c5 rook by moving the knight into d7. He has a potential discovered check on our king via this long diagonal here, g1 to a7. And he's got other pieces that are crowded around our king as well. So our king's safety here looks like it's in jeopardy. The knight could potentially hop to f3 with a sacrificial check. The rook could come into g4 after that if he takes g takes f3. These are other ideas that we have to pay attention to as we go into calculating the candidate moves and going deeper into understanding this puzzle. So piece activity wise, I would say that he has a slight advantage, except for this knight on a7 that's just doing nothing right now. Our rook on b1 is a little bit passive, so is our knight on c2. Our queen, other than this effect down the diagonal, is currently not doing a whole lot on a3. We have a rook that's pretty active on e2, and his rook on c5 is active, and so is his rook on h4. So I'd give him a 10 to 20% advantage in the piece activity domain. King safety, both kings have some motifs working against them, so I would give it a close to a wash, but maybe a little bit better for him. And space-wise, both sides are about equal. There's a lot of empty space in the middle of the board that we're fighting over with our pieces rather than with our pawns. So let's take a look at what we think is going to be the most probable outcomes. I think that a checkmate theme could play a factor, but it's not the main outcome that we're going to be shooting for. Our opponent would have to make a terrible blunder to allow a checkmate in this position, but perhaps the possibility of a checkmate in certain variations will limit what he can do, and we can exploit that limitation to our advantage by playing a forcing move. So I would say the chances of checkmate is 10%. I would say the chances of winning material are much higher. And winning this c5 rook looks quite likely. This h4 rook isn't really under attack. Possibly we could win this knight on h2. We could possibly win the queen on b6. So I'd say it's mainly those 3 pieces of his that are under the most amount of pressure by us. So with that in mind, let's see if there's any other motifs we can look at. If this pawn were to ever move into the d5 or the f5 squares, and we could potentially bring a rook into e8, that's another idea. This rook could form a battery with the c rook and hit the knight on c2, or he could maybe even take on c2 with the discovered check. The queen here, after knight to d7, a discovered check with the rook loses the queen because we can take the piece that's giving the check. So there are limits to what he can do with that discovered check. And after takes, we would also be threatening mate on a f8. So that is something to be considered as well. Okay, so with that in mind, let's hop into the candidate move analysis. So the first candidate move that jumps out to me, and I did have a brief look at the puzzle beforehand, is knight to d7. So knight to d7 hits this queen on b6 and also hits this rook on c5. It's a fork. So he can give all sorts of discovered checks with the rook. There's many different possibilities. Most prominently, rook takes c2 check. There's no double check, though. Keep that in mind, thanks to our knight blocking the c1 square. So rook takes c2 is one idea. Rook to a5 is another idea. In both cases, I think we would just take the queen with the knight on d7. And if he were to go to rook a5, he would take our queen on a3. We would capture back and we would be up a rook. If he goes rook takes c2 check, we just take the queen for nothing. and then he could take our rook on e2, but after that, he's getting mated on f8. So he also has to defend his back rank, so he doesn't even have the time to capture our material, and that would also look very devastating for him. Just to go over that again, knight to d7, rook takes c2, check, knight takes b6, and he can't capture on e2 because of queen to f8 checkmate. So that was the idea behind that variation. Let's see if there's any other candidate moves. We could consider sacking our queen here on c5. He would take back with queen takes c5. And we don't have any other forks or any moves with a knight. This is also with a check on c5. So we would have to respond to that check. And if we go to the f1 square, that looks really bad for us with knight to f3 coming with a check, rook to h1, and I think that actually would be checkmate. So queen takes c5 for that reason and other reasons, including, but not limited to, just wanted to sound as much like a lawyer as possible there, like a bad move for those reasons. Other ideas that we can look at. So nothing really that we can do with this rook. If we do nothing, of course, he does have rook a5 check, winning our queen on a3. If we were to play like an empty move, like rook to d2, he could just play rook a5 check. We could block the check with the rook, and then he just takes the queen, and then we take back with a knight, but we've lost a queen for a rook. Another idea is knight to d3, knight to e3, blocking this check opportunity. The problem with this move is it looks a little bit passive. It's not really doing that much for us. And I like knight to d7 a lot better. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and play knight to d7, which I strongly believe is the correct move in this position. Okay, so he plays knight to f3 check, not a move that I considered. And here we have to think carefully about how we want to respond. So we can play the king to f1, or we can play the king to f2 if we were to run. And then we could also just take the knight by playing g takes f3. So this seems to me like a kind of like a desperation move. And it's one that we have to consider carefully because there are three options that are all pretty good. And I wouldn't just jump to taking the knight with the pawn right away, even though that looks very tempting, because he might have some tricks up his sleeve. So let's say we do take the knight. He can play rook to g5 in that case, and that would be a double check. So he's checking our king with the rook as well as the queen, which means that we can't just capture one of the checkers. That's one of the principles behind a double check, is your king has to move because you can't relinquish both checks in one turn. And so our king would move, let's say, to f1. It looks like that's the only legal move, in fact. And then after that, queen to g1 is checkmate. So taking the knight would be devastatingly bad for that reason. If we put our rook on f1, he can give a check with his rook on h1 and force our king to the f2 square, which is our other option. So I'm trying to see if there's any advantage to luring his rook to h1 for us, as opposed to just going to king to f2 right away. So to shed some light on that, let's consider king to f2 right away. Another thing to consider is that after king to f1, he could also just play knight to h2 check. And then our king could go to e1. We wouldn't want to go back to g1 because that would allow him to just repeat moves. So king f2, there is still no double check in this position. So after rook to c2 or rook to a5, we can still just take his queen on b6. So that looks pretty good for us. The rook to h1, king to f2 looks like it is about the same, although he could consider just taking the rook on b1. In that case, we would take his queen on b6, and then his rook here is hanging, and he can't take on c2 or anything like that because, again, we have this queen to f8 motif. Um, so having a little bit of trouble at the moment distinguishing between king to f2 and king to f1. So I think we should take a step back and think about what we're going to do. So let's go into story time and see if we can take our mind off of the puzzle for a moment and just talk about something else. So, one thing that I've been trying to do with my chess improvement is really focus on exploring the beauty that's inherent in a position for the purpose of understanding the position deeper rather than always just calculating for the sake of going for a solution, always looking into the future. So the idea here is to be very present when you're solving positions in chess. There's some psychologists that say that your unconscious brain can compute a lot more than your conscious brain can. We know that there are limits to how much we can store in our working memory, for example. There's only about 6 to 8 objects for the average human that they can keep in mind. So if I gave you a phone number that's too long, let's say a phone number that's like 15 or 20 digits, the vast majority of people wouldn't be able to repeat that back to you because they don't have that much storage in their short-term memory. So similarly in chess, if we're only using our conscious brain to think about the puzzle in this very rote and calculating way, there's a limit to how much we can understand and extract from the puzzle. But to get fully our subconscious behind us, we have to muster up our emotions. We have to really be enjoying ourselves. We have to get into a flow state. And getting into that flow state allows the unconscious parts of your brain to just kind of absorb the puzzle. And that's part of what we're doing in this segment where we divert our attention away from the puzzle, is that we're thinking about other things. We're thinking about palm trees in Florida. We're thinking about avalanches in Alaska. We're thinking about ski slopes in Utah. Just listing a few things that people tend to enjoy. We're thinking about going out and playing laser tag. We're just taking our mind, taking our attention off of the puzzle and letting it kind of sink in a little bit to our subconscious processing layers. Another fun thing that I've been doing recently is I started watching the movie The Matrix. And I don't watch the entire movie in one sitting. I like to split it up into chunks. And so I have time to process the movie between viewings. And I'm about halfway through the movie right now. I don't want to spoil it for you guys, but it's really interesting and commentary on our modern world that has become a lot more relevant with the advent of AI and LLMs in the last couple of years, and the possibility that AI is going to be sentient and have its own will. But this movie was released in 1999 before anyone knew that these things were going to happen. Although it was interesting that in 1997, just a couple years prior to that, the IBM Deep Blue computer became the first computer to defeat the world champion of chess, who was Garry Kasparov at the time. So people had start to become aware of the possibilities of AI, even though we didn't see any sort of general intelligence in the form of an LLM at that point. And of course, AI can get even more advanced in the future with other iterations like robotics and the ability to generate videos. That's something that OpenAI is working on. And I've seen a lot of AI fakes out there that, frankly, in some cases are really funny. So AI having the emotional intelligence to create something that makes me laugh is another step in its sentience. But yeah, really great movie, and just a lot of really kick-ass action sequences to enjoy as well. And I really like the performances by Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne. Anyways, let's get back to the puzzle and see if we've gained anything from our little diversion here. So let's just check G takes F3 again. So G takes F3, rook to G5, double check. He's got these two rooks cutting off the escape squares of our king on the G and H files. And we're forced to play king to F1. That's the only move. And then queen to F1, supported by the rook on G5, is going to be checkmate. So our calculation there is solid. King to f2, I don't see a reason why we don't play king to f2, is the thing. And it looks like the more direct move. Um, let's say he plays rook to f5 check, lining up another discovered check on our king. And we take on b6, just take his queen. Now it's his turn. So he can play a discovered check now with his knight. Let's say he moves his knight to d2. Then we can play king to e1, and now we're threatening to pick up this knight on d2, as well as threatening this mate on f8 still. So rook to f5 doesn't seem to quite cut it for him. Rook takes c2 check. Knight takes b6, and now he can play rook takes e2 with a check, but we can just take on e2, and he's down a lot of material, and he doesn't have any forks like that on our queen, so that all looks like it checks out as well. So king to f2, I'm not seeing why we wouldn't play that move. And if king to f1, he can just play this check, and then our king would be forced to go to f2 anyways. Except now he has his rook on h1, which is also kind of a bad thing because our rook is threatening to capture it for free. But I don't see what additional ideas that gives him to have that rook on h1. So with that in mind, I'm just going to play king to f2. And that is the correct move. And now he plays his rook to a5, which we had already anticipated. And here we're just going to take the queen on b6, which gets rid of the checker, and puts us up 9 points of material in one move. So two advantages in one move. So we're going to take that queen, and that's the end of the puzzle. Okay, so let's explore why it's king to f2 rather than king to f1. We're going to fire up the engine here. This apparently was between Larina and Rutsky, with Larina playing the white pieces. So first move, he takes the bishop, knight to d7. And here we looked at a couple of options already. We looked at rook to a5 check, and we looked at rook takes c2 check. And it looks like it just leads to the same outcome. We just take the queen on b6, and he takes here, and then we take back with our knight, and we're up a rook. So that's not too surprising. What was surprising was knight to f3. And let's say he plays rook takes c2 here. We also just take on b6. And here we're up even more than in the previous variation. He's got to go back and defend his king against a checkmate here. And after knight takes, well, he can't play knight takes because it would be mate. He can play king to g8 and to stop the mate. Let me see. So, yeah, if he just played king g8, we would just take on c2 with our rook. And here we're up a whole queen. So let's go to the knight f3 variation then. So after knight to d7, knight to f3. And here if we went king to f1, waiting for the engine, and here the key move for him is knight to d2 check, which I think we considered briefly. It may be in one of the other variations. But here, knight to d2 check, and the engine is kind of glitching out on me. It says rook takes d2. And then here, rook f5 check. Okay, so let's see why this is bad. King to e2. The engine is going really slowly at the moment, probably because I have only 8 gigabytes of RAM on my Surface tablet, which is what I'm recording this on. I'm a college kid. Queen to f2 check. King to d3. Rook d5 check, and he's leading our king on a chase here that's going to lead to him winning some material. And these are all with checks. So after king b2, he's got a queen to c3 check, sacrificing for a moment to pick up our queen and end this threat of mate on f8. And after king takes, rook takes, he's up in exchange. So the key idea here is that he can get his knight out of the way with a tempo, and we have time to, and then he has time to play rook f5 with a check. Whereas if we play king to f2 and then he tries knight to d2, he doesn't have that tempo, and we're taking his queen with our knight. So that's the key difference between those two moves. A pretty difficult variation to calculate. I think I just intuitively went king f2, and it happened to be correct, but we would always like to improve our calculation in the future. So I'm going to study this variation for sure, and in case we ever come across it again. So I hope you guys enjoyed this puzzle. I hope that you were able to, like me, gain a deeper appreciation of the puzzle. Like many of you, I am on my chess improvement journey. I'm hoping to increase my puzzle rating to 2,500 by the end of the year. And in the process of doing that, increase my over the board and my online rapid rating as well. And that's all very exciting. And if you guys have any chess improvement stories you want to share your progress, go ahead and post a comment below. And we can discuss it and see if maybe I could have one of you guys on here at some point to solve some puzzles together. So if you guys enjoyed the video, give it a like, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.